everybody. Welcome back to Exit Podcast. Today, we're talking to Greg Hoover. He's a longtime executive, advisor, speaker, and author of Lead Anyway, Ordinary You, Extraordinary Impact. How are you, Greg? Welcome to the show.
I'm terrific, Ryan. Thanks. It's great to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Thrilled to death to have you, and thanks so much for making the time for us. Well, you've got kind of a long story to tell, so we should probably get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about just sort of who you are, what you do, and why we're speaking today.
Sure. Probably the best place to start, my career, worked my way up and was an exec, spent probably close to the last 30 years at the C level, chief operating officer, chief marketing officer, chief executive officer, president. And those companies ranged from, my family's business, which is kind of where I got my start, was under $10 million. And ranged all the way up to I was the COO and chief marketing officer for Atlas Van Lines, which was just under $1 billion at that time, about 985 million. And so really that kind of informed, my growth and who I was and how I worked and how I managed. And then 2 years ago, started my own consulting practice, Third Star, and works basically with companies. Started out as a consulting gig, profitability, P&L work, efficiencies, staff development. But with the publishing of my book, has really kind of shifted more into staff and team development, and leadership development, and how to make their companies more effective and efficient. And that's led to some keynote speaking and workshop work. So kind of a pretty broad range.
No, I love that. Well, I wonder if maybe we can, I guess, based on what I know about you anyway, kind of look at the elephant in the room, which is you had all those titles, CEO, COO, president, all these things. But one of the big things that you espouse these days is that it actually isn't really that much about the titles. And so I wonder if you'd talk sort of about just sort of your experience and what brought you around to that way of thinking.
Sure. Well, it probably started, during my own career. All of your growth and all of your leadership opportunities essentially come from being present, right? Being intentional, being in the moment, taking action, being decisive. And, that initially was about me and my growth and how I developed and what the next role would be and where that came from. But as I grew in my career and was working more with teams and leading others downstream from me, it just became evident, right? Who are the people that I look for and lean on to make things happen? They're not necessarily leaders in title or role. They're people that I can count on to show up, right? And to be intentional and to take action and be decisive. And that just led itself along the way for my career. And then when I started the consulting firm, my work initially was really project-based. Hey, we need help with this strategic plan, or we need, a tactical application for our strategic plan, or we want to improve our P&L or our profitability. And I started to notice that 9 out of 10 times that wasn't about lack of talent, or even really about a bad plan, a tactical approach. It was about a lack of clarity and alignment. People downstream weren't getting communicated to and weren't on the same page. And that really gets back to the same principles, clarity and communication, alignment, and leadership becomes about how much we're all on the same page as opposed to having 10 best players, in the game. And so that just kind of led that way, and it's kind of become a passion for me because I just think and every one of us is capable of impacting the world around us for the better, and doesn't matter if you're the president, doesn't matter if you're the team captain, the principal, the high school, the teacher, the all-star. Everybody on any given team or organization has the ability to impact and make the room better when they walk into it. It's about your energy, it's about your intention, and it's about a call to action. And so that's really where that has led my work.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I think what I like about it too is that there's no shortage, and just having been a worker bee myself a lot of the years, I can say there's no shortage of guys on the line or in the office that will quickly tell you how they're smarter than the CEO, right? They're the one who leads, and the CEO is just this big idiot and all this stuff. But I think it's refreshing actually to hear it coming from the other direction, and I think most intentional leaders start to fall into this. But I wonder if there was a moment maybe when somebody, without authority, maybe led better than somebody with, or if you had some maybe example where you could kind of demonstrate where I guess we've heard these sort of anecdotes, oh, well, the Disney Imagineer mentioned something to Bob Iger
Sure.
and then it got implemented or something. There's stories like that, but I wonder if you had anything like that in your career.
Yeah, I don't know that I have anything specific. It's more for me, over the course of my career and leadership roles, it kind of becomes this. I'm trying to even think of the word here, but just a sense of like, who do I count on, right? Who, we all, if you're a coach, a lot of my management styles informed. I've been a coach over the years in various athletic endeavors, and as a coach, what do you look for? You look for the kid that shows up early to practice, the kid that takes extra work, the kid that might not be a starter, but is there to do whatever the team needs him or her to do. And those people become your leaders. And those are the people that you count on, even though they may not be a starter. And, I just started to notice that. And, I think I noticed it first for myself, right? How did you get promoted? Well, you got promoted by doing those things, by being intentional about delivering and showing up and taking action and not waiting for permission, not waiting for a title, not waiting for somebody to anoint you as the guy in charge of the project. And it just started to be this sense that that's how things happen. And that's where leadership comes from. And then when I moved into leadership roles, it was really more about how do I now intentionally develop that in the people on my team, that work for or with me. How do you groom people to grow up and take more responsibility? And it's just really about being intentional in the moment and giving those people permission to take action and to lead, to encourage their leadership.
Yeah, I love that. I remember there's a kind of a funny story, but like I remember I've always been a little bit of an introvert, which is funny because we've been doing this podcast for 10 years now and stuff like that. So it's strange for an introvert to behave like this. But years and years ago, when we first moved to Utah, I'm originally from Idaho, but when we moved to Utah, I came down here to work in an ad agency. And I remember I had an opportunity there. Basically, I was giving them a month of my time for free in exchange for just an opportunity to be a fly on the wall and learn a little about the business. And so, but I remember sitting outside in my car, waiting for the door to open because I'd gotten there early, like you were talking about, trying to be there early and impress. And, these guys didn't know me, so I was trying to do really well. And I just remember going over and over in my head that for me anyway, it was the idea of have an opinion. So for me, I was just like, have an opinion, go in there and say something. Like,
Sure.
even if people ask, like, maybe I don't know the right answer or whatever, but I'm going to have a thought about whatever you say. And for me, that was a big boundary shove, right? Pushing myself out of kind of a comfort bubble, but into something like that. But I then proceeded to work for this company, and I moved basically from an art director role all the way up to creative director in about 3 years, which is really fast for them. And but a big part of it was just exactly what you're talking about. It's intention. It was doing the work I was trying to do purposefully. And in my case, I was really having to push myself out of a comfort bubble, but I saw an immediate result. And so I wonder, as you're seeing, talking about your own experience and work and all that stuff, but then also trying to make a line or a distinction between sort of people who are natural leaders and those that maybe we could call formal leaders, the people with the titles. What do you think that like a formal leader or somebody who's gone, let's say they've gone to school to become, gone to business management school and they become a manager or whatever, so they've gone the path. What do you think they misunderstand about influence?
That's a great question, and I think the answer to me is that it's not about your title, it's not about your role, and it's really not even about experience or background, because a lot of that comes, again, whether you're an athlete or whether you're in management or whatever it may be, that comes from experience, right? All of us learn kind of quote unquote on the job. I think the big thing that I see today is those who are in leadership but not leading effectively. It all comes down to communication, and what how much clarity is there, how much alignment, how much are we all on the same page or even understand what the mission is. There's an old adage, and I don't know where it's from, but I've used it forever. You tell them once and you think they're done. They hear it 3 times and start to understand it, and it takes 5 times for them to get it. And I think the problem with a lot of leadership in positions today is you tell them once and think you've done your job. And a lot of times you may not even tell them. You just assume, well, they know the mission statement. I had a client a couple years ago that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on developing a mission statement and a strategy and a vision. And they would refer to it in these company-wide meetings. And finally, one meeting, and God love the woman that did it, she raised her hand and she goes, you keep talking about this mission statement. What is the mission statement? And it's like they had shown a slide once and just thought everybody knew what it was. And you have to be repetitive. One of the things that I really stress in my work, I'm an 80-20 guy, and I'd rather that we execute fully and completely at 80% than that we spend all our time trying to grind out that last 15 or 20 and be perfect. I just think that's where results lie. And parallel to that is simplicity, right? I'd much rather, one of the exercises I do a lot of times when I do my workshops is, it's kind of a variation of the telephone game. And we all remember the telephone game, right? You have a circle of 10 or 12 people. And the way I do it is I start and it's got to be a 3-sentence complex instruction. And so, do this, then do this, then do this. And by the time it gets to the end, it bears zero resemblance. Why? Because huge chain of command, complex instructions. And then we play it a second way, and there's 3 people, and you have to limit the instruction to 3 words. And what happens? It gets to the end and it's perfect every time, because I've shortened up the communication chain. Everybody's hearing the same message. It's a simple message that you get. And so I think a lot of organizations today don't communicate, don't have clarity, they don't have alignment. And I think one of the big things that I see in tons of businesses is people think complexity is better. Being more complex is smarter, and it's not. It typically is lost in translation downstream.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about just this notion of lead anyway. It's the title of your book, but it's also just kind of, I think a general philosophy for leading. And I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about that. And I kind of wonder how that gets applied. In my mind anyway, and maybe I'm misinterpreting it. So speaking of communication here, I'll give it my shot. So for me, this notion of lead anyway is like, even when things are hard or whatever, just lead anyway. Or even if things aren't going perfect, or maybe they are going well, but whatever, just lead anyway. Maybe you hit some resistance or you have a hard time, just work your way through it and lead anyway. Like, and basically for me, it feels more like I don't know, almost like beating the drum, or sort of this mantra that you could implement, which is this notion that just like, it doesn't really matter. All this noise, everything else that's going on in your world doesn't really matter. The job is to lead. So just lead anyway. And maybe I'm missing the point entirely, but I wonder if you talk a little bit about where that came from, what that means to you, and how you apply
Sure. Well, I think to me it has 2 applications, and I think you hit the first right on the head. It's lead anyway. It may not, if we're simple and we're guided and we're working on a focus, here's my plan of attack, lead anyway, to your point, regardless of what's going on around me, stay focused, stay aligned. The other application I like to think of is, you may not think you're a leader. You may not be a leader in title. You may not be a leader in role, but you can lead anyway. And, that gets back to the things that we talked about. What are leadership characteristics? It's not necessarily a popular thing today, but I'm a lifelong Kansas City Chiefs fan. And there's a guy who grew up close to where I did. He grew up in South Bend, Indiana. His name was Greg Hoover, and had a great receiving career at Bowling Green State. Transferred his last year, played at Alabama, and he signed with the Chiefs on a practice squad. And he signed in the same year that Patrick Mahomes signed. And he called Patrick up and said, "Listen, I'm trying to make this. I want to make you better. How can we work together?" And he worked in that first off season. And he became, when Mahomes wanted extra work, wanted to throw routes, wanted to work on his game, he called Garrett Dieter. Dieter only started, played. I think he started one, rostered maybe 3 or 4 games, but he's got 3 Super Bowl rings. And if you see Patrick Mahomes out today socially, if he's not with Travis Kelce, he's with Garrett Dieter, because this guy was 3rd string at best, practice squad guy, but he did the extra work. And the Chiefs, he had a consulting role. He was making great money. That's leadership. He's not the all pro. He's not the guy everybody knows because he starts every week, but he's leading. He's leading anyway because he's not the starter. He's not, and so that's, to me, and that's really where I come from in the book, is there's lots of little practical things you can do in every moment to be a leader and to make that situation or the people around you in that situation better. One of probably the thumbnail that I use the most when people say, what does lead anyway mean? And I say, if you see a fire, do you stand around and wait for the fire truck, or do you look for a hose? And the person that's leading anyway is looking for a source of water to try and put the fire out until somebody bigger gets there. And that's, to me, that's really at the heart of it.
Yeah, no, and I really love that Dieter story as an example, because I think there's a lot of people who, I think the expectation is that our leadership class are somehow perfect, that they're expert, that they know everything about everything. And I think that's where a lot of the descent further down the line starts to happen, right? When you as an employee or whatever expect something exceptional from your leaders. But a lot of times it's not about just like intellect or, it being the Harvard MBA or whatever. Like a lot of times it doesn't really have that much to do with that. It's got a lot more to do with the ability to read the room, to give people the tools they need, the way to communicate, to use your language. I mean, I think that there's a lot of facets that make a strong leader that actually don't have that much to do with, like, I guess what we might call intelligence, so to speak. Maybe
right.
it's back to the emotional intelligence versus the intellectual intelligence. But it's not about being a Mensa
Sure.
guy. It's about being thoughtful or
Yeah.
having a different set of skills.
I think it's about engaging, right? And there's a story that I tell in the book. I'm kind of like you. I think I'm really an introvert. I do public speaking. I've been that guy forever, but I can't stand going to a cocktail party. I can't, I'm just not, that's just not my gig. And I was that guy. I like to walk. And, when I moved back to Indiana from Salt Lake City, I moved into my neighborhood and I didn't have a place to hike. So I'd walk, and I'd get out and walk 3 or 4 miles a day through my neighborhood. And if I saw somebody coming, I'd look down, or just, I was not engaging. And I was going through the action of getting the book published. And I thought to myself, that's kind of stupid. I need to practice what I preach. And so I got intentional about, when I'd see somebody, I'd look them in the eye and speak to them, just say good morning. And one day I was about 5 blocks from my home, and there's a woman out working in her yard, and her yard always looked spectacular. And so I'm walking along, and I'm on the sidewalk, and she's 30 feet away up in her flower bed. And I said, hey, good morning. I just want to let you know that I think your yard always looks great. I always admire it when I walk by. And she stood up and turned around, and I thought she was going to burst into tears. And she said, you know what? That just made my day. You don't understand. I've had a horrible week. This has been one of the worst weeks I've had in a long time. And sometimes you just want somebody to notice, and I really appreciate that. Well, that's leading in that moment, right? And it's a small thing. It's a small action, but I made her better. I encouraged her. And she introduced herself, and, for the next 6 months until she moved out of the neighborhood, we'd speak every time we saw each other. And I think I talk a lot about, back to my football metaphor, we think leadership is throwing the overtime touchdown in the Super Bowl, and it's not. Leadership is showing up in practice day after day and doing the repetitions, and it's in the small things. Those small things lead to the big moments and big opportunities, but you don't get to the big moments and big opportunities without taking the daily little steps and the little actions and the simple things. And that to me is where leadership lies, is in those small moments.
Yeah, I love that. And we started calling it on this show the 10-year overnight success, because we have so many people come on that are CEOs and founders, and, all have achieved whatever level of success they've got and things like that. But for the outsider, it's easy to see that and just go, oh, well, here's Greg, and Greg's doing great. I just want to be like Greg. But the reality is, Greg only gets to be Greg because he's been working for 20 or 30 years. Greg doesn't get to just be Greg because he showed up today on the block. And so I think that that's a really good thing to point out, that it really is this active accumulation more than it is just a single event.
Once you start digging into it, and I don't really care who it is, right? It was interesting. About 3 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to speak at my old high school. And they built a new weight facility, and they were kicking off a summer conditioning program for their athletes. And they asked me to come in, and we did 2 sessions. We spoke to the coaches first for the school, and then we spoke to the student athletes. And ironically enough, talk about karma. The night before, there was this kid, Tanner Andrews, who'd graduated from my high school 10 or 12 years ago. Was an amazing athlete, 3 sports, all world, went to Purdue on a baseball scholarship, pitched, was drafted out of Purdue at college by the Marlins, and slaved away in the minor leagues for 8 years. And the day before I was giving my speech at Tippecanoe Valley, he was called up to the majors by the Toronto Blue Jays, and they first game in, he pitched a perfect ninth inning. Well, most people would say, "Oh, good for him. He made his dream." Dude, 8 years in the minor leagues, nobody gets called up when they're 30 years old. And and I said in that moment at the school, I said, everybody thinks Tanner Andrews, gosh, what a break. He finally got to play in the majors. Tanner Andrews has been pitching for probably 17 years,
Yeah.
Correcting his craft and getting better and trying to make an impact. And so more and more when you see these stories, that there's a lot of that behind it. The guy who's the all-world athlete, he didn't just show up that way. He's been practicing and working hard and showing up early and doing the extra work. And it's always about that. We just don't always see it.
Yeah, no. And I think it's important to point out too that, I mean, there are, your occasional genetic freaks, your LeBron Jameses or whatever, but don't think for a second that he's not putting in all the work too. I mean, he may be gifted genetically or be built perfectly for basketball or whatever, take your Leo Messi's or whatever. All these guys are maybe perfectly tuned for their thing, but they easily could have just sat on the sofa and not played basketball. So, so I mean, there's plenty of room where these people.
Probably the most famous example ever, right? I'm a Michael Jordan guy, and cut from his high school basketball team. I mean, 2 years before he was an all-world freshman at North Carolina, his coach told him he wasn't good enough to play high school basketball. And so what defines that moment? Do you say, well, the hell with this, I'm not, I'm done with basketball, or do you go out and work that summer and get better and make yourself good enough that they can't cut you the next year? And then all of a sudden, bang, zoom, you're playing at North Carolina. I mean, it's all about putting in the effort and the hard work.
No, I think that's a good lesson. I'd like to circle back to what we were talking about with the lead anyway thing, though. I wonder if there isn't a spot that we could talk about where leading anyway actually becomes overstepping, which is sort of the maybe the other side of that coin, which is maybe when people who shouldn't be leading are sort of taking ownership of things and shouldn't be.
Sure.
So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about maybe the other side of that coin, which is, the downside of leading anyway.
Sure. Well, I think, there's leadership, and there's leadership in title, and there's leadership in role. And, I like to draw the line. We're all made better by action, right? But taking action within what's needed in this situation, what setting am I in? Like if I'm in a meeting, a team meeting, or let's say a committee meeting, and there's 6 or 7 people and there's a chair of that committee, it's not my role to lead that meeting. That's his role. But it's my role to engage. It's my role to share ideas. It's my role to execute what my role is within that team and make that better. And back to I fall back on athletics a lot, but the second or third team player, it's not her role to tell the coach how he should be running the team. It's not her role to tell the starter what they should be doing. It's her role to engage and to fulfill her expectation and her role and work hard and be where you're needed. So I do think there's a fine line. You have to respect authority. You have to respect the lines, but there may also be a point, and as long as you do it honestly and positively, yeah, there may be a time that you need to have a conversation with the quote unquote boss or the leader of that committee and say, listen, I feel like we've got some issues, and here's where I have a problem with that. Now, there's a way to do that, right? You don't do it in front of everybody else. You don't do it hypercritically. It might be a side conversation. But even at that, one of the organizations I worked with, it was a high school, and they had kind of this mantra that the coaches used called mission over relationship. And the whole point was, well, even if he's your best buddy, the mission comes first over you being best friends. And I said, well, I get that, but I also think relationship is important because there's a positive way that I can correct, that I can lead, that I can instruct, that I can help make you better. And that runs both ways. It runs from the top down, and it runs from here up. And that's all, it comes back to, instructing in love or caring about people and how you go about taking action. And I think as long as you're coming from a place of kindness and a place of empathy and a place of love and truly a place of trying to make things better, then I don't know that you can really overstep as long as you're within those guidelines,
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that's a good take. I wonder too, just, and maybe this is sort of the tail of that prior question, but it's kind of, what do you see, or how do you see the difference between influence and authority? And I ask because I think it's possible to negatively influence people or positively influence people, but I don't know that we always see the negative influencer as the authority on something. And so I wonder if you just maybe talk a little bit about how you see that.
Sure. I'd start with this. I think everyone has influence. I don't care who you are. I don't care where you're at in the hierarchy. I don't care what your role is. Everybody has influence. If you show up today, what energy do you bring to the room? We talk a lot in team applications with athletes. Are you somebody that people are excited to see at practice, or are you somebody that people see and think, oh man, I got to work with Susie again today? And that's influence, right? So we all have influence. We just determine, is that good or bad? And it's as simple as what your attitude is. Do you show up with a good attitude and you want to do the work, and how do you want to go about that? I think authority, there's authority in title and there's authority in role. And I'll go back to the example we talked about. Do you think people listened to Greg Dieter on the practice field? 100% they did. You don't have to be a starter. What's your attitude? What do you bring to the room? What do you bring to the game? And you earn respect by that. People respect the person that shows up and works hard and does those things. And so if authority a lot of times comes from my impact and what I'm doing to make things better, whether I officially have authority or not. And that goes the other way, right? You could be a person of authority and role, but people don't respect you because of the way you lead. I had a client I worked with that, one of the things coming in where it was strategic planning, but kind of a side note to that was, we feel like our culture's broken. We just don't feel like we have a good culture. Well, in the first 4 months I was with this client, I had 20 some opportunities to meet with the COO. And some of those were one-on-one, some of them were team meetings. A couple of them were company-wide meetings that the COO called. They were on time once in those 26 or 27 opportunities. And one of them was a company-wide meeting where the COO called it on a Friday night in the summertime at 5 p.m. And it was an hour-long required company-wide meeting. Shows up 10 minutes late, spends 5 minutes telling everybody how important the thing they had to do was, more so than the team and the company, and then spent the next 10 minutes repeating what was covered in the first 10 minutes of the meeting. Now, why is your culture broken? That person has authority, but they're not leading with respect. They're not leading with integrity. They're not being cognizant of others and what they ask. And so it works both ways. I think you can earn authority through your actions without having authority and title. And I think you can have authority and title and not have authority or respect of your peers because of the way you exercise that or how you treat people.
I love that. Thanks for that. So I want to pivot and talk a little bit about just sort of leadership and operationally challenging businesses. I mean, you spent a lot of your career in transportation, logistics, relocation, moving things around, lots of moving parts there. And not to say that other businesses are somehow maybe less sophisticated, but when you've got real world consequences, like, if something breaks or if a truck's running behind or whatever, like there's a lot of logistical problems that start to come up. So I wonder if you just talk about like what those industries taught you about leadership that maybe you wouldn't get in, I don't know, think of like a tech startup or a white collar industry versus something that's a little bit more hands-on.
Sure. The first thing without a doubt for me is simplicity, right? And I think right behind that, I've already mentioned a couple of times, but I think simplicity, I think clarity, and I think alignment. I kind of became, over the course of my career, I became known as a fixer, right? I was the guy, if you had a customer service problem, you had bad scores, I became the guy that was known for, let's just cut through the morass, let's simplify this, clean it up. And I had 2 or 3 examples over the last probably 10 years of my career where we came into a setting that was dire in terms of customer service and turned it around in short and with great results. And it's just typically, and I think this applies across the board to whatever you're working on. What's the problem and what's the simplest way to solve it? Cut to the chase, eliminate all the noise and all the BS. And it gets back to the point I mentioned earlier about complexity. If you've got a customer service problem, you want to create committees and you want to, well, we could fix this and fix that. And That's not the answer. I mean, the answer is to be simple. The other thing, which as you work with companies that you see a lot of, and I think it falls under the category of complexity, is you manage or you create process or you create systems for the exception. Well, that one time we had this happen and we need to manage for that. No, because that happened once out of 100 times. Manage for the 80%. If I do this and I fix the fundamental basic problems, now I'm succeeding at a higher level and my scores go up and I'm better and people trust me. And now I get momentum behind that and we start to get better. It's almost always, to me, and it was interesting because as I started consulting, my consulting work has been, quite honestly, probably less than 40% of my work has been in the industry that I was in. I've worked with tech firms, I've worked with nonprofits, and it almost always is, look, just clear out the clutter and step away from this stuff and cut to the chase. How do I fix this? And now let's fix it on a larger scale, and then be repetitive about that. And I think, especially today, right? I think, we tend to look at technology, or we tend to look at these things, and complexity is not the answer. Nine out of 10 times complexity is exacerbating our problem.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And it's funny too, just kind of the way that you're talking. We've really started to discover on this show that a lot of the things that we believe in our lives that make us unique actually aren't unique at all. We actually all kind of do the same thing all the time. And so your notion of simplicity, I think, is very true, because like, no matter what the business, really, the fundamental truths are kind of the same thing. So whether you are leading a tech company, and I guess that's, an example of that is just the fact that, only a small portion of the work you're doing today is in your former industry. So I think that's, it may be some evidence that things translate, and not to mention, the amount of energy you put into sort of using coaching metaphors and things like that, like all the way down to just the most basic, human performance. It's the same stuff all the way along the road. But one thing in particular that I think that you have in common, like if I was trying to think of sort of how transportation companies and logistics companies might relate to, let's think of white collar or tech companies, things like that, is when people are distributed and they're working under pressure, dealing with, stressed out customers, things like that. You guys maybe have a little different experience because, your truck drivers interfacing with the person at the shop or whatever. But I wonder if you'd just talk about sort of managing large distributed teams like that, and how we can keep up. One of the themes that we've talked about so much in this call is communication. So how are we communicating and keeping people all the way out at the end of these really long tendrils involved in the company and part of what we're doing?
I think the first thing is, and again, I know I sound like I'm beating the same drum, but it's clarity and focus, right? What is it we're here for? And I think the second thing is, we talk about lead anyway, is you're stepping up and taking action, but at the other end of the management chain, I should be telling you how you can take action. Hey, here's some things you can do to fix the situation, right? If you get in this setting, here's the permissions you have from me to go out and fix this, because a lot of times we don't do that. One of the really interesting settings I had was a great company, privately owned, but it was a mobility company, and had good quality, but they were having problems with scores, and they were doing business with the world's largest relocation company, and they were on service watch, which for that company was under 88% of customer satisfaction. And so I went in, and what's the first thing you do? Well, let's talk to the people and find out why they're unhappy. And so you call up, and they had a very simple, really good rating system. The client did. On a scale of 5, what are we? Would you use this again? Yes or no? And if it was no, most people said, oh, they wouldn't use this again. Well, that kills our rating. I went to the client and I said, can we call them and ask them why? And they said, nobody's ever asked us that before. And I said, well, let's find out why they're unhappy and give us an opportunity to fix that. Literally overnight, our scores went from 87.5 to 94.5, and we won probably the biggest quality award in the relocation industry the next year for this client. Out of 400 vendors, we were one of 2 that was given their cup for performance. Why had nobody ever thought that before? Let's call them and ask them what they don't like. And the customer says, well, isn't that kind of cheating? Well, no, they're not happy. Let me call and see if I can make them happy. Most people, it was some simple misunderstanding or something that we could do on the phone call. And, at the end of the day, the client said, well, that makes sense. I mean, we want them to be happy too. We want them to have a good score and feel good about the situation. But why had nobody ever thought of that before? It's like we put ourselves in this box. Oh, well, the client's unhappy. We better not call him,
Yeah.
and it just becomes simple. And I think, in tech firms, it's the same way. I saw an old clip the other day, and with Steve Jobs, and they were talking about complexity and success, and he says, a lot of people start with the technology and then try and figure out, well, from this technology, how do I make the customer happy? And he says, my technology is never going to be perfect because I start with the customer. And I say, I want the customer to be happy. How can I deliver that? So it might not be the best software. It might not be the best programming language. It might not be, but this is my end result. And if I'm delivering to that, I'm always going to be good. Whether you think it's the best technology or the best programming or the best language for doing that, this is the answer. I mean, over here. And, back to the football analogy, if I'm winning Super Bowls, I don't really care if you think I'm a good quarterback. I don't really care if you like my offense. I don't really care, what you say in the off season. If I've got 3 out of 5 Super Bowls and I've been to 5 of the last 6, that's success to me. And that's how I define that,
Yeah, no, it's something that we always tell. My older son has now graduated high school and is into college, but both my boys were football players. And so our younger son is now 15 and he's starting at the high school this year. And that's one of the things that we're constantly telling him is this notion of just be undeniable, right? So like as you go out there, do the work, show up early, do all that stuff. And you don't have to worry about what anybody says if you're totally undeniable. People
Right.
might call you names or tease you or whatever, but if you go out there and you do your job, you're going to be fine. And and I think that to just pile on with the sports metaphors here, I think that that's a really great way of looking at just life, business, relationships, whatever you've got. It's pretty easy to do away with the criticism, if you're winning. And so I think that that's a great thing.
My take on that was with my kids growing up, and really through my life, it went back to when I was a kid. Is be beyond reproach. Be in a position where, if there's doubt, if there's question, you can't be questioned because you're putting in the work. Nobody's going to question the guy that showed up 10 minutes early for practice and stayed extra to do the extra work. Be beyond reproach. Put yourself in a position where some questionable thing comes up at school and there's 5 kids involved and they say, well, Greg would never have done that. That's just not Greg. I mean, be beyond reproach. And to your point, it doesn't matter as long as you're doing the right things, do the right things, and don't worry about the rest of it. The rest will take care of itself.
Well, I think it's one thing, especially I see it with a lot of young people too. There's just this, I don't know, everything is so performative. We're busy doing things for the sake of other people. We like what we like because we think other people will like us liking that
Sure.
thing, or we buy the thing that we get, but it's not that we care so much, but we think other people will think it's cool or, whatever it is. And
Sure.
I really see that in teenage boys, right? I mean, having raised a couple of them now. And so
100%. And don't you think parallel to that, it somewhere in the back of our head, there's this thing that we've got to be perfect, right? Like, I've got to play to this standard, which is what everybody else expects and wants from me. And I've got to be perfect. And in my own career, I fought that for years, looking for the perfect solution. I mean, quite honestly, I've got a coach that I work with, and this book wouldn't have been published without her help. Rebecca Babcock is her name. And I'd been working on the book and a year ago, about right now. She said, so where are you at on the book? And I'm like, well, I got a little more. And she goes, look, you will edit on this thing for 8 years if you let yourself, get it done and publish it. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's got a message. The message is good. Get the message out there. And so I think, to your point, I think we're performing for other people, and somewhere in that is this perfection syndrome that I can't perform for other people unless I'm perfect. And how many people is the world denied? How many great leaders? How many contributions? I mean, again, not that basketball is the be all end all, but what if Michael Jordan had said, screw it, they cut me, I don't want to play basketball, Don't worry about that. Go out and make yourself better so they can't cut you. And next thing you know, you're in the conversation as potentially the greatest person to ever play the game of basketball.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, you mentioned earlier being an 80-20 guy, and I really like that. And, maybe it's perfect for this conversation, but it might feel like an oversimplification to people. But like you can really apply that, like even just using the anecdote you were sharing before about the quality ratings, and this company, getting these people that were saying that they weren't having a good experience, and just even the notion to reach out to them, was so foreign to them. But it's like, most companies, especially if you've got any kind of scale at all, you probably are doing a reasonably good job. 80% of the time people are happy. 20% of the time they're not, or your product is 80% good enough. And then, and it's these little tiny nits, that are the thing that people get caught up on that, makes them hit, 1 star instead of 5, and it's not generally that. So, but like, cause we're talking about sports now, maybe if you want to be Michael Jordan, it's got to be more like 90-10 or 95-10 or whatever, because you're dealing with such competition. But I think to your point about the perfectionism or whatever, that 80-20 rule is a pretty nice abstract, or like a sketch of how, if you just kind of managed your life like that, I think for the most part, you'd be in a pretty good spot. Maybe you'd do a little better in some spots or a little worse in some spots. But if you're on average an 80-20 guy, I think that really, it addresses most of the issues we're talking about here.
Yeah, and for me, I use that in a sense of taking action, right? Like, I don't have to be perfect to take action. Now, once I take action, I can correct to that and I can coach to that. And your analogy about Michael Jordan, sure, the famous, when he started his career, he was known for offense, and people didn't think he could play defense, and he became a multiple winner of the NBA Defensive Player of the Year award, right? Because that's a flaw, so now I'm going to work on that. But there was a guy, a huge mentor in my life, passed away in a private plane crash, but was the high school football coach where I grew up, and we became great friends over the years. And he at our high school had never played football before. He started it from scratch, and in the first 8 seasons we were 74-6 and played for 2 state championships and won one. And this is a little farm school out in the middle of nowhere with 600 kids that had never played football before, and he just executed fundamentals to the T, lifted weights back in the 70s when nobody was lifting weights. And we won the year they won the state championship. It was a couple years after I was gone. The last game of the year, they won 81-0. And there were two quotes that came out of that in a press conference. The first was, "Do you think you're running up the score?" And he said, "Fellas, the JV played the 3rd quarter and the freshmen played the 4th. And until you let me dress the 8th graders, that's the best we're going to be able to do." But the other thing, the reporter from the big Fort Wayne Journal-Gazette said, you guys run off tackle an awful lot. Like, you block it to perfection and your backs are amazing. That year they had 3 guys rush for more than 1,000 yards. But don't you think you run off tackle too much? And his response, he looked at me, he says, "Well, when they learn how to do that, we'll show you something else." It's execute simply, execute to the nth degree. And it's not about complexity, and it's not about having a playbook that's this thick. It's about, I do this really well, and if I do it to the best of its ability, you can't stop me. And so I feel like at some level that comes back to it. It's all about simplicity. And I'm 80-20 for me is about, don't wait around to get to 100. There are things, obviously, if you're a pilot, or a doctor, but generally speaking, most of us sit around and use that last 20% and how to collect it as an excuse not to execute and not to take the first shot. And I just don't believe in that. I think we need to get out and do the work, and I think you should strive for perfection. I think that's important, but I also think there's a point in time where what's that last 15 or 20% worth, and we could be making a huge impact right now by just doing this.
Well, and I think that there's a big, like maybe a point in there too. I think I read when I was briefing up on you, did I read that you're a race car driver too?
Used to be, yeah, had a couple years at SCCA, yeah.
Yeah, so see, so with something like that, right? So there's a level of business acumen or even success with a business or a product or whatever the 80-20 is good enough for. And so, but, in the case of racing, you need to level up for that, right? And I think what that sort of demonstrates, if we're using that as a metaphor, is that, for a lot of leaders, sure, 80% will probably be better than most places are. They're probably already working at 65%. So if you get up to 80, you're already, so much better. But I think you can find things in your life or specific things you want to focus on or become expert at, back to the Michael Jordan version, or, name your athlete, Patrick Mahomes or whomever. There's a version of this where there is good and there's great, And then, but if you really want to be the next level, you got to be the next thing, whatever the next thing is. And so that means they can be 80-20 on 90% of things, or I guess stick with the 80% of things. So they can be 80-20 on 80% of things, but then maybe they're going to be 90-10, or maybe go 95% into the one thing, so Mahomes is going to be the best quarterback, but, and I'm just making this up, but maybe he doesn't scramble as well as somebody else might. So maybe he's an 80% scrambler, but by God, he's a 95% ball thrower. So I think there's room to maybe specialize in there. So I think that's kind of 80% being used as sort of a symbol for like, get most of the way and don't wait to start. But then I think there's also room to refine on the other end.
Well, I think there's a kind of a second point of view to that. And, you're right in racing, but I would have never started in racing if I thought I had to be 100% to start. Right. So that's kind of how I look at it. Is 80-20 to me is, listen, let's jump in the pool and let's get started. I may not be Michael Phelps, but I'm also not going to be anybody unless I start swimming. Now, when I get to be Michael Phelps, now there's a case to work from 90 to 95 to 100 and iron those last things out. But for me, it's a lot. I like 80-20 in the sense that in a business sense, there's a lot of good that we can do at 80 to 85%. Rather than not doing anything because we can't get to 100. And personally, I think it's just about taking action, back to the fire truck analogy. Are you the best fireman in the world? No, but find a hose, because at 80%, if you got a hose and there's a fire going on, you got a chance.
You're better than the alternative.
And so that's kind of how I view that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I mean, maybe the biggest or most expensive version of this that's being done in public right now would be something like a SpaceX or something, where, I mean, how many rockets do you got to blow up? I mean, eventually, if you're going to start putting people on them, we're going to want to be better than that 80-20.
Right.
But, if you got 80% of the rockets up and only 20% of them blew up, that's probably better than most places. So,
and I think it might be better than that already. Yeah. The misnomer is, what's the old thing about Babe Ruth? Who struck out the most times in baseball? Babe Ruth. I mean, you don't get to be SpaceX and put a rocket into space unless you blow a few rockets up. You're going to crack a few eggs if you're making omelets, kind of thing. And that's the other side of it is, we expect, and I think that's an expectation that we have a lot today, and discourages people from leadership. Because there's this expectation, well, he can't lead. He's not perfect. The only guy that can lead is the guy that's never made a mistake. Well, boy, what a crock that is, right? I mean, nobody gets to here without making mistakes. Nobody gets to here without going through those challenges or having to work more, getting cut from their basketball team. I mean, that's probably one of the great myths about leadership is only the people that can lead us can only be perfect. And it just doesn't happen.
Yeah, it's funny. I talk a lot about it in using sort of this like layer cake metaphor, that it sort of, in order for you to put on the next layer, you have to have done the prior layer. And that almost requires that you will have made mistakes or whatever. And so I have this stupid meandering phrase, but this notion that it's taken me every step I've ever taken to get to where I am today. Meaning there's no wrong turns, there's no left, I should have gone right, but I went left, none of that along the way, because in reality, the only way to arrive at this seat today with this conversation with Greg is through all the steps I took to get here, right? And I think
good, bad, and otherwise.
Yeah, and I think if you think about things that way and sort of recognize that you're always being made better through your experiences, whatever that is, I think it gives you a little bit of room to maybe forgive yourself and be a little easier on yourself. You don't have to regret every decision you ever made or whatever.
Sure.
And then, you start making steps towards whatever goal it is you want to achieve next. If you're going to try and move into some new career or whatever it is, then you can start making those steps. But, you can't have got to that decision without all the prior.
Yeah, so I think it's never over till it's over, right? There's always a next chapter. There's always only you decide that the book's done. And I loved, one of the, I was going to say, it doesn't seem like it's that long ago, but it's kind of a classic now. But, Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point, right? I mean, listen, it's 10,000 at-bats. It takes 10,000 at-bats to get the major leagues. That's just what it takes. We've looked at it. We've analyzed it. You got to do the work. You got to do the repetitions. It's not going to be perfect, but that's what it takes. And at some level, we've got to stop expecting perfection and just start respecting the work, the repetition and repetitive work.
Yeah, I love that. Let's take a quick minute and just talk about early career leadership. For a lot of people, especially young folks now, I think there's a lot of Gen Zers and beyond that get kind of a nasty rap, or there's some I don't know, stereotypes being applied to that generation of kids in terms of their success or their abilities and their work ethics and et cetera. Um, those kids come out of school, they don't have any authority, no reputation, nothing. And I think, some people are maybe genetically predisposed or by virtue of the way they were raised, maybe they're kind of designed to be a leader. But what does it look like for somebody with really nothing who needs to learn basic fundamentals? It's one thing to say you need to be a good communicator, but like, how do we actually get these kids to where they need to be?
I had an interesting opportunity this spring, and still working on it. I don't know how it's going to evolve and develop, but I got a call. I think it was in March or April, and it was from a woman who is an agent, a sports agent, primarily in basketball. And she had somehow come across my website and some of the work that I was doing. And she said, "Do you have anything that you would propose for NIL athletes? And for those who aren't followers of the NCAA and the latest iterations there, it's name, image, licensing, and it basically is the vehicle by which college athletes can be paid, right?" And I said, "Well, that's funny. It's funny that you asked that because I've started working on a program." And she said, "I primarily work in basketball." And she goes, "I have no shortage of guys that can score 35 points a night and have a 30-inch vertical jump and have 500,000 followers on Instagram. And they don't know the first damn thing about showing up on time and being a good force in the locker room and supporting their teammates. And so, I'd really like to work on that." And that's, still to be seen. We're kind of doing some developmental work there. But I've got a workshop that I do, a 6-week basic workshop that's for kids out of school, and you see a lot. I get a lot of leads come across my desk that are, "Hey, I just graduated. I'm looking for my first job. How do I make myself more valuable?" And I basically kind of distilled the executive work and the corporate work, and I distilled it down. And it's a 6 weeks program, and it's just fundamentals, and it's just that kind of stuff. Show up on time. Be the person that you would want to have on your team. Do you show up on time? Are you respectful? Do you contribute? And there's just a lot of those kinds of things. I used to tell my kids, and I was blessed. I had 2 amazing kids, great students, and just good people. And I used to tell them, "Listen, show up on time and do what you're told, and you'll be running your team in no time at all." Because how many people? I mean, we see it over and over. You're trying to interview people. People don't show up for interviews. People don't have any concern for showing up on time for work. Or, I had a company I was working at 6 months ago, and they said, "We got this problem. She's great at her job, but she's used all her vacation up and she keeps taking time off." And we said, "Listen, you're going to be docked pay." And she said, "Well, I don't care. Don't pay me." That's not a teammate you can count on. That's not somebody that I can put in a dependable role. And so a lot of it just gets back to fundamentals. At the back of my book, I've got a 30-day, just a practical day-to-day, how you get better. And it's really crazy, simple stuff. Pick somebody out today and say hello. Make eye contact and say hello. Show up 5 minutes early for a meeting that you've got this week. Challenge yourself on something that's difficult or you don't like. Finish things. I mean, and that's what that program, that 6-week program, that's kind of geared more to those kind of entry level startup, career people. It's just the simplest stuff. And it's probably some sad statement about society or culture today that so many people just don't get that. How can I do better at my job and get promoted? Hell, show up, on time and make a difference. I mean, it's not complex stuff.
Yeah, I have a theory that it has something to do with just kind of all the noise in the world these days, that it's really hard to focus on things. And so the most basic fundamental stuff is getting overlooked because we're busy chasing the shiny new thing. And so whatever that is, right? And so I think that that's helping us, or helping young people take their eye off the ball. And it's funny, you mentioned how you spoke to your kids. We obviously did a version of this too with our boys, and no disrespect to janitors, but we always say that the world needs janitors.
Sure.
And, but the world also needs people to run companies. And, and if you guys can show up to work and do work at school, like, the bar is going to be low for your generation because there's going to be a lot of people who aren't ready to
Right.
go into leadership. And,
Yep.
you know, and so same kind of thing is just, you know, trying to help these kids really understand that, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for them and it doesn't really take that much to be a standout.
Yeah.
So,
Well, even the janitor, right? And I 100% agree. Like I could without hesitating rip off three guys that were incredibly impactful to my life when I was a kid, and they were janitors at the schools I went to, you know. But guess what? If you're a janitor and you excel at being a janitor, and I can count on you, and you're on time, and you pay attention to your work, and you're respectful to people, you're going to move up. You know,
yeah.
you're going to move up as a janitor. You're going to be the head janitor. You might end up being the head of engineering or maintenance. I mean, who knows? Because
Yeah.
the people that move up are the people that give a damn and care and are intentional and show up and make a difference, you know?
Yeah, it's funny. Years and years ago, really early in my career, one of the guys that first gave me opportunity to work as like a paid design guy was this guy, Don Aslett. And Don Aslett was known for a while as the world's #1 cleaning expert. He's multi-time, you know, best-selling author, you know, all kinds of stuff. He had 40 titles, all this stuff. He's passed away recently, but he basically started a janitorial company when he was in college to pay for school, and then went on to build this company called Varsity Contractors, which was, you know, this nationwide company, every state in Canada, you know, all this stuff, and this, you know, enormous janitorial company. But I would still come to work sometimes and catch him well into his 70s, wearing his painter's, you know, coveralls, sleeping in the office, you know, because he didn't go home that night, you know. And so he always joked, I mean, even though he did well financially and all that stuff, he always saw himself as a janitor, you know. So so no offense to the janitors, because there's definitely room to grow there. Here in the last couple minutes, and let me know if we're getting right to the edge. I know we started a couple minutes late, so if I need to let you go, you can say so. I just wanted to talk to you real quick about sort of the personal reinvention and sort of evolving your own identity. And just so it's kind of a personal question for you, I'm actually in the middle of writing a book too, and it's sort of on this notion of being able to move your identity forward to overcome what I've coined or what we call the lid. And it's sort of this invisible barrier that keeps us from achieving our next layer of success. And but a big part of that, or a big part of my argument, is around identity shift. And you've moved from somebody who worked your way up through companies to leading companies to now public speaker. And like we talked about before, you being a little introverted, and now here you are public speaking and all that stuff. So I wonder if you talk a little bit about just your own personal journey, you know, this identity shift that basically you had to make to be able to live up to the roles that you moved through over the course of your career.
Well, that's been a really big focus. I mentioned Rebecca Babcock earlier, my coach, and that's been a really big focus of my work with her over these last couple of years. Because, and again, you know, for the 8 millionth time on your show, I'll draw the parallel to athletics, right? A lot of athletes struggle. You know, I think life is 3 phases, right? There's the learning phase, there's the playing phase, and then there's the third phase. And we determine what that third phase is. You know, a lot of athletes, you grow up as a student and maybe playing college and you're learning the sport. And then you are a professional athlete and you do that to whatever level for 10 or 15 years. And when that's over, right? I mean, what's the famous line from Rocky where, you know, Adrian says, when this all the smoke clears and everybody's done chanting your name. And I think all of us go through that at some level. And for me, you know, I had 25 plus years where I learned how I would execute at work, learned my job, learned my role. And then I had this great, you know, 20, 25 year period where I was at a C level, and it was all about my title. And I would have told you at the time that I did not take satisfaction from, or my value wasn't driven by my title, but it was. And all of a sudden, when your title's gone, all kinds of things. First of all, I've got to reinvent. I've got to execute at this level where that used to be executed for me. You know, I've been a public speaker for 25 or 30 years, but I used to produce events. Everybody made sure everything worked, and I showed up on time and walked on stage and did 45 minutes, right? Well, now I got to find places to speak. You know, I've got to determine what content do they want and how do I make that applicable. And so it's for me, it's been a shift away from reliance on authority by role into this is what I'm good at, and this is who I'm going to be, and this is where my value comes from, right? And it's a shift in that. It's not, I don't care who you are. If you're the starting quarterback and that's over and you got to retire, what's next? And a lot of that for me personally has been an assessment of what are my skills, what are my values, and how do I want to apply that to make the world better? And that becomes a shift for how I move into this next phase. And It hasn't been easy, but it's been really interesting to me, and it's been kind of fun. I mean, understanding and it's again, we go through this at various times in our life. Most of us, when we get out of school and go get a job, I talked about one of the programs that I work. That's what that's all about is, listen, you're not a student anymore. You're not at home and your mom's feeding you breakfast and getting you out the door. You're not at home and your dad's helping you with your homework or whatever the roles may be. But now you got to move out. You got to show up on time. You got to be responsible. You got to check the boxes and do the work. And that's a shift, right? And then you shift maybe from that into, I've been doing the job, and I remember my first leadership role. It's like, wow, I mean, I got to go into this meeting and people expect me to be the guy in charge. Like, well, how do I be the guy in charge? And then you're the guy in charge. And then when that ends, now what's next? And so, life to me, we don't always realize this, but life is just a series of reinventions. And, I think it's important that we know what our values are. I think it's important that we're honest about our skill sets and what we do well and what we don't do well and need to improve. And I think if you're honest about that and open to the possibilities, then, really the world's a clean slate. And within those contexts, I think you can do whatever you want to do,
I love that. That's perfect. Well, thank you so much, Greg. I really appreciate your time today. This has been an awesome conversation. I actually have, I don't know, maybe 400 other points we could go through. So we could keep this thing going all afternoon. But thank you so much for your time, Greg. I really appreciate you. And any sort of parting shots, where can people learn more about you if they want to find the book or maybe hire you to speak? Where can they get in touch?
Sure. My website is thirdstar.net. And you can, all kinds of ways on there to contact me if you want a speaking opportunity. It's got some examples of some of the things we do. I'm on LinkedIn as well, Greg L. Hoover on LinkedIn. The book is available on Amazon.com, Lead Anyway, Ordinary You, Extraordinary Impact. And it's been a real pleasure to be here today, Ryan. I've enjoyed the conversation and appreciate the opportunity to join you.
Absolutely. And thanks so much to everybody who tunes in the show this week and every week. And we'll see you guys next time.